I'm Nikki Lowe and welcome to the Wisdom for Working Mums podcast show, where I share insights and interviews that support women to combine their family, work and life in a more successful and sustainable way. Welcome to this episode. I'm your host, Nikki Lowe, and today I'm talking about how to deal with uncertainty. And I'm recording this episode in response to a message I received from one of my lovely listeners, Felicity in Melbourne, Australia. And you may have heard me mention Felicity on a previous podcast because she regularly emails me after listening. And recently she messaged me to ask if I could do an episode on how to deal with uncertainty. And as you know, I'm always really keen to create content that's most useful for you as my community. So I had to take her up on the suggestion. But let's quickly talk about why is it important to be thinking about uncertainty and talking about uncertainty now. And at the time of recording this, it's the end of October 2020, and we're kind of so many months into this pandemic. And this year we've seen uncertainty take on a whole new level for most of us, not knowing when the pandemic will end. And while it's here, the uncertainty of really the impact on our daily lives. You know, how long will schools close for? When will they open? And how long will they stay open? When will we be able to return to our place of work? And when will I be able to see my family at Christmas? Will that happen? When will I be able to next travel abroad? What impact is this having on the economy? What does that mean for the financial stability for my family? And if you're kind of here in the UK, at the time of recording, there's lots of uncertainty about what tier our region's in and if and when that might change. So we're all having to navigate uncertainty like never before. So really in this episode, I wanted to kind of explore how do we kind of gain a foothold when the ground around us feels so unstable? And how do we regain our sense of power when it feels like everything's out of our control? And that's what we're going to be exploring. So in this episode, I'll be covering why uncertainty can be so difficult and some personal strategies for living in uncertain times. But before we dive in, I'd like to do a listener shout out. And I'd like to thank you, SC Bally on Apple Podcasts. And I hope I've said your name right. And SC Bally wrote, I came across this podcast after feeling utterly overwhelmed as school, work and family life picked up pace last month. I'm a psychologist, and whilst I know many of the theories and lessons about work-life balance, looking after your needs, getting organised, I wasn't listening to myself. Hearing this podcast was like listening to a trusted friend telling me to step back, slow down and check in. It was just the voice I needed. And thank you, SC Bally. That comment about listening to a trusted friend is just so wonderful to hear, as that was always my intention when I set up this podcast. And I hear you, sister, about, we know this stuff, but often we need to be reminded. And I know often I'm sharing what I need to be reminded of too. So I really appreciate you taking the time to share your review. And as I've said before, it gets lonely here in podcast land. I never really know who's listening and what the impact these episodes are having. So if you're listening to this and you've not yet left a review, it would be amazing if you did. You can just head over to iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcast, rate the podcast and leave a review there. It would really mean the world. Not only does it help me to continue to create content that's really useful and relevant, it also helps more working mums like you to benefit from the show, because the more reviews the show gets, the higher in the rankings it gets shown and the more people that get to see it. So now back to dealing with uncertainty. This is actually a topic that I've supported people with for well over a decade now. With my work on emotional intelligence, I've been invited kind of over my career as an executive coach to come into global organisations to support their employees with navigating uncertainty, and that might be due to merger or acquisition or restructuring. And I've also taught leaders on how they lead through uncertainty, because often they set the emotional tone for their employees. So understanding how we respond to uncertainty and what we can do to support ourselves and others through it can be really useful. But let's just take a moment to think, what is uncertainty? And it's defined as a situation, outcome, or result that's unknown or unpredictable. And I think that pretty much sums up 2020 so far, don't you? Now more than ever, we're living in what the military call Vuca Times, and that's VUCA. And the V stands for volatile, the U stands for uncertain, the C stands for complex, and the A stands for ambiguous, which for us as humans is challenging. We each have a different response to uncertainty, and some people are energized by it and some see it as a risk. And if you think about it really as a spectrum, on the one end of the spectrum is certainty and the other end of the spectrum is uncertainty or variety. And we each have a preference for where we sit on that spectrum. So it might just be worth checking in with yourself and just doing a sense check of where's my kind of natural inclination to be on that spectrum. And life can be unpredictable, but our minds don't tend to like that. Our minds tend not to like uncertainty. They don't respond well to not knowing, to the gap that uncertainty creates. And as our brains have a negativity bias, that's part of our evolutionary process, it's our survival kind of mechanism, we tend to want to fill that gap and create more certainty and control, even when it's not there, because control and certainty give us a sense of safety, and uncertainty upsets that status quo. We're not sure what to do, and for most of us, we're doers. We find safety in really taking action, and that prompts a sense of insecurity, which can increase our anxiety, both real and imagined, and we can feel more fearful, and that then can spiral into us questioning our identity and self-esteem. So you can see how this year, for some, may have taken us on this kind of negativity spiral. If you do sit on the side of the spectrum that's energized by uncertainty, the chances are you're more energized by self-generated uncertainty than uncertainty that's caused by others. And, you know, some people say, oh, I like uncertainty. And I always remember Tony Robbins saying that, do you like surprises? And he asked the audience, and people go, yeah. And he's like, no, you like surprises that you like. Surprises that you don't like, you call problems. So I think sometimes we like uncertainty, but the chances are it's self-generated uncertainty that we still have a degree of control over that we liked. I used to think I was okay with uncertainty, and I was a kind of go with the flow kind of person. That was until I had children. And it turns out that I actually like a lot of control in my life, and the kind of uncertainty I actually like is when I create it, not when it's thrust upon me. So even if you're someone who normally likes uncertainty, the chances are that the external uncertainty of COVID isn't sitting well with you. So what can you do if you're struggling with all this uncertainty? Well, the first area that we can pay attention to is our thought patterns, because this influences how we feel and whether we're able to adjust our feelings and behaviour to the changing conditions. And we can get stuck in thinking patterns that imprison us or trap us and feed that sense of uncertainty and lack of control. When our nervous system is heightened and it feels on high alert, we tend to become more rigid and less flexible. So it can feed our sense of uncertainty and lack of control. So one of the strategies you can use is to pay attention to your focus. As the saying goes, where your focus goes, your energy flows. So if you focus on all the things that feel uncertain or out of your control, guess what you're going to feel? And there's a psychological concept known as the locus of control, which refers to how strongly we believe that we have control over the situation and experiences that affect our life. And if we have an internal locus of control, we tend to feel more empowered and have a stronger sense of kind of agency, even when things feel out of control. And if we have an external locus of control, we focus on outside circumstances and the kind of situation, and we tend to focus our efforts there. And it's almost like focusing on the weather. When something's so out of our control, it can trip us into learned helplessness, where it's almost like, what's the point? Nothing I do is going to make a difference. And COVID is an external event that's happening to us with relatively limited control over it. However, what we can control is where we put our focus. Do we focus on the concerns, basically the things out of our control, or do we focus on control, the things that we can control and that are within our influence? The more we can grow our sense of and our circle of control by focusing on the things and issues that we can actually do something about, the greater our sense of personal agency, kind of the power we feel we have in our own life. And that moves us really from a reactive focus to a proactive focus. So I would really be encouraging you to focus on what you can control and try and grow your circle of influence. So actually taking action that makes you feel that you can do something about it. And when you're feeling disempowered, it can be really useful to connect to your sense of personal power, really reminding yourself of your resourcefulness. Perhaps times when you've been really resourceful, maybe having a child for the first time, because for many of that meant we had to adapt to a new normal, cope with huge amounts of uncertainty. So reminding yourself when you've done this before and that you can do it again, or perhaps reflecting on difficult situations you've had to overcome, remembering you've overcome them then and you can overcome them now. And it might be connecting to your strengths, as these can anchor you really when you're feeling like you're in these choppy waters of this year. Or it might be creating a mantra or an affirmation that reminds you of your resourcefulness in the times when you're not feeling it. Something as simple as "I'm strong and capable," or Glennon Doyle's mantra of "we can do hard things," or perhaps Marie Forleo's "everything is figure-outable," which reminds us that no matter how difficult and uncertain things feel at the moment, we will find a way out of this. It can also help to establish stability zones, things that give you a sense of control and stability when the ground feels really unstable beneath your feet. In the sports world, and particularly sports psychologists work with athletes on this, and I've been fortunate over my career, I've got to work with Olympic athletes and Olympic sports psychologists in my work, and seeing the kind of strategies that they use and apply that can be applied to all of us. And one of the things that they talk about in the sports world is really helping them to zone in on something they call controlling the controllables, to zone in on the things that are within your personal power and to build really your sense of stability, confidence and resilience by focusing on them. So for an athlete, that might be, really focusing on their training, because that's within their control, their nutrition, their sleep, all of those little things that when you combine actually help them feel like they've got control. So when they turn up to compete and they have no control over what their competitors have done, they get anchored to that sense of personal power by controlling their controllables. So you'll notice that athletes tend to have rituals that anchor them during the pressure of competitions. And if you've got a favourite athlete, you may have kind of noticed over time they tend to do the same rituals before they compete. And I remember my dad using rituals to create stability in his life after my mum died. He created habits that really, looking back, I didn't realise at the time, but now realise that they helped him feel really safe and secure during one of the most difficult times of his life. He's an ex-military man, so I think he did some of these things instinctively, but he knew the importance of creating small, regular habits that gave him stability. Almost like he knew what was going to happen to him week to week, to the point that he used to tell me that he'd wash his white shirts on a particular time of day, on a particular day of the week. And I used to think it was a little bit kind of crazy, but looking back, that gave him his sense of certainty. And he had particular meals on particular days of the week. And that gave him a rhythm to his life after such a kind of traumatic loss and such kind of massive uncertainty in his life. And to some, this would have seemed over-planned, and to me it did at the time, but for him, it gave him an anchor in his life. So I would encourage you to think about the things that are in your zone of control and that give you a sense of personal power. And so rather than focusing on if and when we'll go into tier 3 or the news or the fear-mongering that goes on in the media, and just remembering that the whole kind of media industry thrives on what we call FUD, which is fear, uncertainty and doubt, can we instead focus on the things that are within our control and influence? So that might be our family, our loved ones, our work, And the things that are proven to build our resilience, that the acronym NESTS is really useful to think about. So the N is nutrition, the E is exercise, which I tend to think of as movement more than exercise. The S is sleep. The T is creating some time for you to replenish. And the S is social connection. So what can we do around those things that give us a sense of control and certainty? The next strategy is about how we respond when we feel fearful. What can sometimes happen when we're feeling kind of that fear and uncertainty is a particular cognitive reaction which holds us back, and it can get us stuck in kind of thinking patterns which imprison us or trap us and feed that sense of uncertainty. And it's a concept known as TCUP, so TCUP, which is thinking clearly under pressure. And that's a term that Clive Woodward kind of used, who was the England rugby coach who took the England rugby team to victory in the 2004 Rugby World Cup. And Clive Woodward was really held up as kind of this leading light in leading people in high-pressured situations to compete at their best. And he talked about TCUP being kind of fundamental to their success, because if we're not careful when we're under pressure, our thoughts start to own us rather than us owning them. So what can we do if we find ourselves not thinking correctly under pressure? Well, the first step is to be compassionate with yourself. You're experiencing a natural evolutionary process designed to protect you. Because if you think about it, as humans, we didn't have super sharp teeth or claws that enabled us to survive as a species. What we developed was this super sensitive brain that would scan our environment for potential threats and then kind of put us into a fear response to protect us. So it's your evolutionary power as a human that's doing its job. You know, your body, your psychology, your emotions are trying to protect you. So when you notice those feelings of uncertainty and fear, kind of just notice them without judgment and with compassion and curiosity. Because when we do that, we can create a space between the stimulus, which kind of is the COVID uncertainty, and our response. And Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor, said in Man's Search for Meaning, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. And that for me is something that I'm really trying to focus on during COVID, about how can I create more of a gap and become less reactive? Because in that space, we aren't defined by our fear. We can see it, we can kind of acknowledge it, but we start to have a choice about what we do with it. It doesn't control or define us. Because when we're stuck in fear, we have to be really careful about the stories we tell ourselves, because those stories can either empower or disempower us. You know, there's been a lot of stories that I've told myself this year, and I'm imagining you have too. Mine have been ones such as, you know, there's no way I can run my business with my kids at home and my work and trying to combine those two. And my work is then going to negatively be affected when the economy is becoming unstable, and, that's going to impact me financially. But the truth is, I've actually had my best financial performance since COVID. And also, another story that I was saying was my dad had open heart surgery during this whole COVID pandemic. And again, the story I told myself that he was really vulnerable and that going into hospital was going to increase his chances of getting the virus. But the truth is, he had a really successful operation and is now recovering brilliantly. And what our brains can tend to do is get into a game of what-ifing. And I'd like to thank my mentor Judy French and Tony Burgess for this. They talk about the what-ifing game. And we naturally go into what if. And, what if I get ill and I can't look after my children? What if my dad gets COVID during his time in hospital? And the problem with what-ifing is that our brains have a negativity bias. And as I talked about earlier, it's part of our evolutionary process. We're just wired that way. So actually, we tend to get into a negativity bias about what-ifing. So we look for all the things that could go wrong. What if my business can't survive this pandemic? What if? But what if this pandemic brings me closer with my loved ones, making us aware of what's most important? What if my business actually thrives? What if my dad is even healthier as a result of his operation? We don't know. And that's the point about uncertainty. We don't know. So we can either do unhelpful what-ifing or helpful what-ifing, and just to be careful about balancing them up. So this isn't about toxic positivity where we're only going to focus on what the stuff that goes well and only think about things going well. But this is about balancing it so that we're not over activating our stress response. And it can be really useful to think about what's the function of the fear that I might be feeling, because all that emotions are really chemically encoded data. If you're feeling fear or uncertainty, there's a message in there for you. And once we understand the message, really the emotion has served its function and it will pass. So this isn't about ignoring or avoiding or kind of just pretending that we haven't got these feelings, but it's about using them in a healthy and functional way and not getting stuck with them. Maybe, fear about your loved ones getting sick tells you how much you love them, and the signal is to reach out and tell them, and that will help process that emotion. Perhaps fear about the economy tells you that providing for your family is important and there's action you want to take to feel more financially secure. What we're doing here is really getting intelligent about our emotions. What's it trying to tell me? What's it signaling me to do? And also, what's it trying to tell me about who I am and what's important to me? And how can I use that to guide me in my decision-making and behaviour? So the key messages from this episode are that it's natural to feel uncertain at the moment, but that as humans, we don't tend to like uncertainty, particularly externally created uncertainty, but that there are strategies that we can put in place. And those are things around concentrating on your sphere of influence and control rather than concern, establishing some stability zones, so habits and rituals that help you feel anchored, being mindful of the stories you're telling yourself, making sure we're balancing out the what-ifing, and using your emotions intelligently, processing them and looking for the function of what it's trying to tell you. What action does your fear and uncertainty want you to take? And focus on controlling those controllables. So I hope that's been useful and sparked some ideas for you on uncertainty that 2020 has created and what you can personally do to navigate this time with more ease. As always, I love to hear from you. Drop me an email or contact me on social media over on Facebook and Instagram, which is where I hang out mostly, and let me know if that's been useful and if there's anything else you'd like me to cover. Until next time, take care and thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode of Wisdom for Working Mums, please share it on social media and with your friends and family. I'd love to connect with you too, so if you head over to wisdomforworkingmums.co.uk, you'll find a link on how to do this. And if you love the show and really want to support it, please go to iTunes, write a review and subscribe. You'll be helping another working mum find this resource too. Thanks so much for listening.